Michael Price's avatar. He's currently helping clients manage their GSA and VA contracts, and he reads every comment.
Today is June 24th, and I'm Nancy, your co-host.
Welcome. I'm Michael Price, your host.
Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It almost feels like engineering. You know, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line in the bone, and the doctor just points at the film and says, there it is.
Right. The treatment is clear. The problem is totally visible.
Exactly. The lines are neatly drawn. But the moment you step into the world of neurodevelopment or combat trauma or chronic conditions, that x-ray machine kind of just shatters.
Yeah, the diagnostic landscape gets incredibly murky at that point.
Totally. I mean, symptoms overlap, pain becomes super subjective, and the whole definition of a cure starts to get very, very blurry.
It really does. It's the appeal of a binary system, right? Like broken or not broken, sick or healthy. We build our healthcare models around things we can neatly categorize and just easily measure, but human suffering doesn't always work like that.
It really doesn't. And today, we are going to look at exactly what happens when the government attempts to apply rigid, simple budgetary math to that very complicated landscape of human suffering.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
We are diving into a massive, and I mean highly controversial shift in how the United States government evaluates and compensates veteran disabilities. Specifically, we're examining a sweeping legislative package known as the Take Care of America's Veterans Act, or the TCAVA.
And just to set the stage here, this shift represents one of the most significant changes to veteran compensation in modern history.
Wow, really?
Yeah. We're talking about a proposed overhaul that reaches directly into the daily lives, the healthcare, and the financial stability of a huge segment of the population that has served in the military.
Right. So to really understand how this happened, we're pulling from a fascinating stack of sources for you today. First, we have detailed policy notes from June 24th, 2026, which lay out the clinical and legislative mechanics of the TCAVA.
Pretty dry stuff, but important.
Exactly. But standing in stark contrast to that dry bureaucratic data, we also have a fiercely passionate transcript from a YouTube creator who goes by the CivDiv.
Yeah, his stuff is intense.
It really is, and he draws heavily on the work of a writer named Elizabeth Hartman. They represent a very vocal, very frustrated segment of the veteran community fighting back against these changes.
The contrast there is just striking. You're looking at the clinical language of federal rulemaking placed side by side with raw, unfiltered grassroots outrage. It paints a complete picture of not just what the government is doing, but how it actually feels to the people on the receiving end.
Exactly. And our mission today is to break down the clinical, the financial, and the political mechanics of a $57 billion change affecting up to 1.5 million veterans.
A massive scale.
It is. And we're going to be looking at actions initiated under both the Biden and Trump administrations. And, we'll be discussing some fiery, deeply personal criticism aimed at the leadership of major veteran organizations. But, and I need to be super clear about this, to everyone listening, we are not here to play politics. We are not endorsing any viewpoints, left-wing or right-wing.
Yep, not at all.
We are simply here to lay out the facts, report impartially, and help you understand the core ideas driving this massive shift. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the magnitude of this controversy really comes into focus when you look at the literal mechanics of the legislation. Because the Take Care of America's Veterans Act is not a single focused bill. It's actually a massive legislative package that bundles together 62 separate veteran-related bills.
Which is pretty common, right?
Yeah. Packaging legislation like this is a very common strategy to build momentum. It allows lawmakers to basically give various advocacy groups a piece of the pie, so everyone has a vested interest in the bill passing.
I mean, 62 bills on paper sounds like an undeniable win for the veteran community. You'd think every veterans group in the country would be throwing a parade.
You would think so, yeah. But legislation of that scale requires a monumental amount of funding.
Oh, there's the catch.
Right. To pay for those 62 new initiatives, lawmakers included Section 108 of the Act, and Section 108 functions as the funding mechanism by finalizing a set of Veterans Affairs rule changes that were actually first proposed back in February of 2022.
Okay, so what do those specific rules actually do?
Well, they do two highly specific things to the disability rating schedule. First, they remove tinnitus, that constant agonizing ringing in the ears, as a standalone compensable condition.
Wow, just entirely.
Yup. And second, they alter the criteria for sleep apnea, shifting the disability rating to essentially 0%, provided the condition is being managed by a medical treatment.
Okay, think of it like this. Imagine working for a massive corporation that suddenly announces a huge company-wide restructuring.
Okay,
Management calls a meeting and says, "Great news, we are rolling out 62 brand new employee perks."
sounds great so far.
Right, but then you read the fine print in your HR packet and you realize they are paying for those 62 new perks by completely slashing the existing healthcare coverage of 1.5 million of their current workers.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening.
It sounds like taking from Peter to pay Paul, but in this scenario, both Peter and Paul are disabled veterans relying on the exact same system.
And the scale of that internal wealth transfer is just staggering. I mean, the VA's own estimates, which are cited throughout our policy notes, project that these specific reductions will pull $57 billion out of veteran compensation over the next 10 years.
57 billion, that's incredible.
It impacts up to 1.5 million individuals. We aren't looking at a minor administrative tweak or a simple adjustment to a federal spreadsheet here. This is a fundamental restructuring of how the United States legally defines and compensates the physical toll of military service.
But you can't just slash $57 billion in medical compensation without a doctor somewhere signing off on the clinical logic, right? Like the VA had to fundamentally rewrite what it means to be disabled to justify this.
What's fascinating here is the underlying medical evaluation model the VA chose to adopt to make that clinical justification.
Oh, right, the WHO thing.
Exactly. According to our sources, the VA is shifting its rating schedule to align with an evaluation model created by the World Health Organization, the WHO.
Now, our sources immediately throw up a huge red flag on that.
They do?
Because the World Health Organization model is designed to evaluate a general global civilian population, right?
Mm-hmm.
But American combat veterans are dealing with traumas of war.
Yeah, very specific traumas.
We're talking blast injuries from IEDs, toxic exposure from burn pits, the extreme physical deterioration of carrying heavy loads in combat zones. Those are definitely not typical global civilian health issues.
And that fundamental disconnect is the core clinical objection raised by critics. The WHO model fundamentally changes how a doctor evaluates a patient.
How so?
Well, historically, the VA compensation system was tied heavily to the actual presence of a disease or injury and the intrinsic suffering it caused the veteran.
Right, acknowledging the pain itself.
Yeah, but the WHO framework shifts the criteria heavily toward workplace function. The evaluation becomes less about what is broken in your body and much more about how well can you manage your symptoms to remain a productive member of the workforce.
Man, that is a massive philosophical shift.
It really is.
You are moving from compensating a veteran for an injury they sustained while serving to essentially evaluating their current economic utility.
Exactly. Now, the VA's stated rationale is that their old rating schedules were horribly outdated. I mean, some dating back to 1945.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they argue those old schedules didn't account for modern medical interventions. The argument is that if modern medicine can intervene and restore your ability to work, your disability rating should reflect that restored functionality.
So if you can go to work, you aren't considered as disabled.
Basically. And we see the stark reality of this logic in how the new rules handle sleep apnea.
Right, the 0% rating thing.
Yeah. The WHO model assumes that if your condition is being managed by a treatment, your disability rating should be aggressively reduced or eliminated entirely.
And the sources tear into this logic using a brilliant comparison.
I love this part.
They point out that arguing a CPAP machine cures sleep apnea because it forces air into your lungs while you sleep is exactly like arguing that injecting insulin cures diabetes.
It's spot on. It doesn't cure anything.
Right, the underlying disease is still ravaging the body. If the veteran takes the CPAP machine off, they literally stop breathing in their sleep. It is symptom management, not a healed body.
Exactly.
The VA is essentially penalizing veterans for complying with their medical treatments.
And the mathematical application of this treatment as a cure logic leads to rating outcomes that the source documents describe as completely poorly constructed.
How bad is the math?
Well, the text provides a very clear example of how a VA rater would have to apply this new math. Under the WHO model, you could have a veteran with severe, debilitating sleep apnea. Their baseline condition is terrible, but the CPAP machine gives them partial, incomplete relief. Because they are experiencing some level of relief from the machine, the rater might only be able to assign them a 10% disability rating.
Wait, a 10% rating for a severe, literally life-threatening breathing condition?
Yeah. Now, contrast that with another veteran who has very mild sleep apnea.
Okay, so less severe.
Right. Their underlying condition isn't nearly as dangerous, but the CPAP treatment happens to be totally ineffective for their specific physiology. Under this new math, because the treatment failed, the rater could assign them a 50% rating.
That makes absolutely no sense.
You have a system where a measurably less disabling condition legally outscores a much more disabling condition simply because the evaluation model over-indexes on the presence and efficacy of a medical device rather than the disease itself.
Wow. Okay, so the sleep apnea math is completely baffling, but the clinical justification for the tinnitus rule is even more contradictory, right?
Oh, definitely.
According to the notes, the new rule states that to get a rating for tinnitus, a veteran now has to provide proof of an underlying pathology.
Right.
But wait, the VA's own clinical handbook, which is quoted directly in our sources, openly admits that the specific cause of tinnitus is frequently unknown. Like medical science often cannot pinpoint why the ringing is happening.
Exactly.
How can a federal agency legally require a veteran to provide medical proof of an underlying pathology for a condition that the agency's own doctors officially state is unknown? Isn't that an impossible hurdle?
It creates a literal catch. 2-2 for the veteran sitting in the examination room. You are required to prove something that science says cannot be definitively proven in many cases.
That's wild. That isn't a medical standard. That is just a legal hurdle designed to deny claims.
And this glaring contradiction was one of the primary reasons these specific rule changes faced such intense, unified opposition from the veteran community when they were first proposed in the Federal Register back in 2022.
Okay, but if the clinical logic is this full of holes and it blatantly contradicts the VA's own internal medical handbooks, what is actually driving this? Why wouldn't Congress just pass the 62 new bills and the TCAVA and scrap the $57 billion in cuts?
Well, the answer lies entirely in the cold, unyielding reality of congressional budget rules.
Of course it does.
Our sources heavily reference a concept known as pay-for, which is commonly referred to in Washington as PAYO or PAYGO, which stands for pay as you go.
PAYGO, the invisible cage around the federal budget.
That's a good way to put it. PAYGO is an arbitrary budgetary constraint initially established by Congress to curb deficit spending.
Okay.
It dictates a very strict rule. Any new legislation that expands mandatory spending, like say new veteran benefits, must be entirely paid for. It cannot add a single dollar to the overall federal deficit. So if lawmakers want to fund a new program or pass those 62 new bills, they are legally required to find an offset. They have to extract that exact amount of money from somewhere else within the existing budget.
So what does this all mean? It's exactly like having a gift card to a massive department store, right? But the store manager tells you that you're only allowed to buy something from aisle B if you first return an item you already own from aisle A.
That is a perfect analogy.
You aren't actually gaining any net value. The system is just forcing you to trade your own possessions back and forth just to keep the store's ledger balanced.
And it forces brutal inter-veteran trade-offs. I mean, lawmakers are taking earned benefits from one group of disabled veterans, those suffering from tinnitus and sleep apnea, and repurposing those funds to pay for new benefits for another group of veterans under the 62 bills.
That's so rough.
And the source material emphasizes that this reliance on PAYGO transcends party lines. It is a deeply bipartisan mechanism.
Interesting.
Yeah, the initial administrative proposal to reduce the tinnitus and sleep apnea benefits was introduced by the VA under the Biden administration back in 2022. But the massive legislative package that actually leverages those specific cuts as a PAYGO offset, the TCAVA was introduced by Representative Mike Bost, a Republican operating under the Trump administration.
Oh, wow. So the budgetary math dictates the policy regardless of who is actually sitting in the Oval Office.
Exactly. And that budgetary math strikes at the very heart of how different factions view the fundamental nature of veteran compensation.
Right, because the sources quote Carol Whitmore, the National Commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW.
Yes, she's very vocal about this.
She pushes back hard against the entire concept of PAYGO applying to veterans at all. She explicitly frames veteran benefits as a debt owed.
That's a powerful phrase.
Her philosophy is that disability compensation is a direct extension of the cost of war itself. It is a national obligation, not a line item invoice that the government can send back or negotiate down just to balance a spreadsheet.
And this raises an important question about advocacy and, honestly, the ugly realities of political compromise. Because the crushing pressure of that PAYGO rule has caused a massive ideological fracture among the major veteran service organizations, the VSOs. You have groups fundamentally disagreeing on how to survive in a system that forces them to cannibalize their own benefits.
Let's look at the American Legion's role in this because their pivot is completely at the center of the controversy here.
It really is.
Because in April of 2022, the Legion vehemently opposed these exact rule changes, right?
Yes, they did. They were submitting detailed, highly technical public comments pushing back against the VA.
They were the ones pointing out the flaws in the WHO model, arguing that CPAP machines don't cure sleep apnea, and demanding that budgets never be balanced on the backs of disabled veterans.
But by 2026, their national leadership had completely reversed course.
Totally flipped.
The American Legion now actively supports the passage of the TCAVA, cuts and all, and their public argument is one of stark pragmatism.
How do they justify that?
Well, they recognize that the VA is likely going to finalize these rules through the internal executive administrative process, regardless of what Congress does.
Because administrative rules are incredibly difficult to stop once the machinery starts moving.
Exactly. So the Legion's leadership decided that if the $57 billion in cuts are inevitable anyway, veterans might as well accept them as the required pay-go offset to secure the 62 other bills.
But the sources point out that in adopting this pragmatic stance, the American Legion's leadership is directly violating their own organization's democratically voted standing resolutions.
Yeah, that's where things get really heated.
The text specifically cites Resolution 33 from 2022, which explicitly ordered leadership to protect tinnitus and sleep apnea ratings.
Right.
And even more fundamentally, it cites Resolution 38 from 2016, which demanded that VA benefits be entirely exempt from pay-go rules, stating unequivocally that no offsets should ever be taken from any veteran to fund another.
And that 180-degree reversal completely isolated the American Legion from the other major VSOs who refused to play the pay-go game.
It's like the DAV.
Yes, the disabled American veterans looked at the TCAVA package and publicly labeled the benefit offset a poison pill.
Wow.
The DAV actually had many of their own top legislative priorities buried inside those 62 bills. They stood to gain massively from the package passing, but they refused to accept the benefit cuts to get it. They chose to hold the line.
And the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the IAVA, warned of a terrifying slippery slope.
Oh, their hypothetical is chilling.
It is. They pose this idea: if tinnitus and sleep apnea are considered negotiable today just to satisfy an arbitrary budget rule, what stops Congress from negotiating away compensation for PTSD tomorrow?
Right, or migraines.
Or toxic exposure from burn pits. Like, if the precedent is set that your physical disability is just a bargaining chip for lawmakers, no veterans rating is safe.
And that fear of a slippery slope perfectly contextualizes the absolute firestorm we see in our YouTube source.
Yeah, it's the Civ Div.
Right. The creator, the Civ Div, and the writer he quotes, Elizabeth Hartman, represent a fierce grassroots uprising against the American Legion's leadership over this exact pragmatic pivot.
And the rhetoric in that video is just blistering.
Very raw.
The creator is explicitly calling on all local posts and members of the American Legion to pull their charters. He is urging veterans to take their membership dues and their financial support to the VFW or the DAV instead.
And the criticism detailed in the sources goes far beyond, like a polite policy disagreement. It becomes deeply personal and cynical.
Yeah, there are explicit accusations from the grassroots level that the Legion's national leadership isn't actually practicing political pragmatism.
Right.
Instead, critics allege they are trading away veteran benefits to curry favor with lawmakers, paving the way for their own personal political ambitions and future congressional campaigns.
And the backlash was so intense that the American Legion seemingly refused to defend their new stance to their own members.
Yeah, the sources note that when the Legion posted their official statement supporting the TCAVA on LinkedIn, they actually turned the comments off.
They avoided posting it to Facebook entirely.
Wow, the fury from their own rank-and-file members was so severe that the leadership had to completely shut down their public communication channels.
It highlights the ultimate agonizing tension in political advocacy when you're dealing with a broken system.
Which really makes you wonder, if you're an advocacy group representing millions of vulnerable people, what is the actual right move here?
That's the million-dollar question.
Is it ultimately better to play the ugly zero-sum game of Washington politics, secure 62 brand new pieces of legislation that will help people today, and accept that you have to sacrifice 2 existing benefits to do it?
Right.
Or do you hold the line on pure principle, refuse to negotiate away a single dollar of a veteran's earned benefits, and risk getting absolutely nothing passed through Congress at all?
It is the defining dilemma of the legislative process. The American Legion chose the path of the pragmatic trade-off, accepting the reality of pay-go. While the VFW and DAV chose to hold the line on the principle that the cost of war is a debt, not a negotiation.
And that dynamic is exactly why this specific debate matters so much to everyone, right?
Uh-huh.
Regardless of whether you have ever worn a military uniform or not.
Absolutely.
This deep dive into the TCAVA is a masterclass in how massive government systems operate behind closed doors.
It really pulls back the curtain.
It shows us exactly how federal debt, arbitrary legislative constraints, and the harsh realities of political advocacy all violently collide.
Yeah.
It demonstrates how easily foundational sacred promises made to citizens can be redefined overnight by simple budgetary math.
And while the political maneuvering and the organizational infighting really capture the headlines, we cannot lose sight of the real-world impact at the center of the paperwork.
No, we can't.
At the core of this policy shift is $57 billion and up to 1.5 million human beings who are caught in the middle of a government actively shifting the legal definition of what the word disability actually means.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the mechanics of that World Health Organization model we explored earlier.
The workplace function model.
Exactly. Think about a legal evaluation model that shifts the definition of a disability away from a person's intrinsic hidden suffering and bases it strictly on how well they manage to function and participate at their workplace.
Right.
If we allow a massive federal institution like the VA to successfully establish workplace functionality as the ultimate legal standard for combat veterans, what does that precedent mean for the future of all civilian workplace accommodations?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
If the federal government decides that a citizen isn't truly disabled as long as they can still drag themselves to a desk and perform a task for an employer, how long until that exact same logic bleeds into civilian disability policies, private health insurance models, and corporate HR departments?
If the standard for care and compensation becomes mere economic functionality rather than actual human well-being, the implications stretch far beyond the veteran community.
Totally.
It completely redefines the social contract for everyone.
It brings us right back to that medical x-ray we talked about at the start.
Yeah,
We all want the clean binary line of a broken bone. We want a system that is easy to measure.
of course.
But when massive institutions start blurring the lines of human suffering just to make the budget math work, we all risk losing sight of the patient entirely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information around you, and we'll catch you next time.
If you found this video helpful, please consider donating to helpallvets.org. Thank you.
A special thank you to MarketUS.com for furnishing us this information. You can reach them at MarketUS.com or call them at 954-636-3232. Before we go, this deep dive was created by the MarketUS.com team. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It's right below the subscribe link.